All right, thank you guys. So I wanted to do 4 things for you guys. We just finished reading applications, and so the first thing I wanted to do was go over some myths about YC that aren't true. The first one, that acceptance rate is not exactly accurate. I'll tell you why in a second. The second thing I want to tell you about is when I read a YC application, some of the things that I find in an application that are negative, that are kind of against the YC ethos and what we're looking for. And then I want to tell you some things that we love to see. And then after that, I want to answer questions because I know you guys have a lot of questions. So get your questions ready. All right, let me pull up my little cheat sheet here. So the first thing I'll tell you is that applying to YC is not as hard as it sounds. The number one reason why companies don't get into YC is because they don't apply. And typically they think that it's hard to get in, especially when you start looking at the acceptance rate. I'll tell you that the acceptance rate is pretty deceiving. When you think about applying to a college, even though it's an open application process, there are quite a few filters that prevent a lot of people from applying. One of the things that YC is very particular about is having no prerequisites. So literally anyone can apply, anyone can come to our site, submit an application. As a result, there are a lot of good companies that apply, there are a lot of not so good companies, there are a lot of people who don't even have companies who apply. So don't think about the acceptance rate and say, oh my God, it's impossible to get in. What I will tell you is that anywhere between 30 to 50% of the applications aren't really founders who are seriously working on their startups. So that acceptance rate is a lot higher than you might think. The second biggest myth is that applying to YC multiple times is bad. It's absolutely not. One of the things that we do when we read applications is we look to see in our software if you have previous applications. And we compare where you are now to where you were when you applied previous. And oftentimes companies get invited to interviews because we're really impressed with the progress that they've made since the last time they applied. If you don't reapply, you don't get access to that advantage. It is typical that more than 20% of each YC batch has applied to YC more than once. In the last batch, we had someone who applied to YC 7 times. He got in on his 8th application, and it was one of the best companies in the batch. So please don't be discouraged, and don't think you can't apply multiple times. The last biggest myth is an interesting one. People seem to think that YC cares about trends. The current trend might be hard tech, or the current trend might be AI or chatbots or whatever. I can tell you that we really do not care. Very much what we're interested in is whatever you're interested in. And we think predicting what the trend is going to be 10 years from now is pretty silly. So you don't need to think when you're applying to YC, oh, is this an industry or a type of startup that YC is interested in? I will tell you that I have funded everything from social media to rockets to literally like a company that makes speakers, biotech companies, drug discovery companies, everything. YC has funded over 1,500 companies, and there is no trend that's discernible, other than they're building tech companies. So if any of those 3 things are catching you up, please ignore them. And if people tell you these things are important, ignore those people. And actually, there's one more. The last one is that you need a recommendation from a YC alum to get into YC. That's also completely false. Even more so, I think what's very interesting is that a bad recommendation can hurt way more than a good recommendation can help. So no recommendations are required either. Now, here are some things that can hurt you when you're applying to YC. The first is a lack of a technical co-founder. When I read an application, I want to see that the founding team has the ability within their team to bring a product to market, an MVP, and get some users. If that team is relying on outsourced development, if it's relying on, it doesn't really know how it's going to bring the product to market, I don't think of that as a viable founding team. So I think that's something you definitely want to be thinking about when you're applying to YC. The second thing is we like to see co-founders who know each other. Doing a startup is one of the hardest things you're going to do. And if you've just met your co-founder, it's possible that during the kind of trials and tribulations, you guys might get into a fight you can't recover from. So one of the things we always are a little hesitant by are founders that have met within the last week or within the last month. We think it's pretty tricky to predict whether that team's gonna stay together. The next thing that we like to see, the next thing that we are a little bit hesitant when we see is how fast are you moving? There are a lot of companies, and there's been a lot of talk around customer development, and sometimes that confuses people and it gets people to think, oh, I need to be doing tons of research and tons of reports and tons of interviews before I build a product. And we think that customer development is good, but it's far better to have a product that you're showing customers, a crappy MVP, than to have a survey. So we're looking for teams that are moving quickly, are getting product to market quickly, are hitting milestones quickly. And another thing that's kind of tricky about an application is when we see an application where there's a massively unequal equity split between the founders. This comes in a lot of different flavors, but it's typically a business co-founder with a lot of equity and tech co-founder with not very much equity. Here's the problem. It takes 10 years to build a large company. And if the founding team isn't motivated over that period of time, they will leave. And so when we look at our equity splits, we really are trying to figure out what you're thinking as a founder. So if we see that you own 95% and your co-founder owns 5%, we think that that person you don't think is very valuable. Or we think that you don't think that person is going to be around for a very long time, or that they're not very committed. So that's a very negative sign on a founding team. That doesn't mean that everyone has to be equal. I personally like when teams are equal, but that does mean you need to take extra attention. And you can't think to yourself, oh, what is my co-founder going to accept now? You have to think, what is my co-founder going to be happy with for the next 10 years? Oftentimes, your co-founder won't know that. One of the signs of a good CEO is that they can see that far in the future and they understand the people they're working with, and they can give the person the equity that they might not know is going to be motivating them in year 4, 5, and 6, when the company looks like maybe it's not doing so well. All right. Let's go to positives before we go to questions. So the first positive that I like to see is clear communication. How many of you folks have filled out a YC application before? Raise your hand. Great. The first question in a YC application is, what does your company do? The first thing the reader is really looking at is, when I read the first 2 sentences of the company, do I understand what the company does? The number one enemy is jargon. We are not experts in whatever you're doing. You're going to be a bigger expert in your customer base and in your industry than the person reading your application. If you try to use jargon words to make you sound more sophisticated, more smart, more industry knowledgeable, the problem is the person reading your application won't understand what you do. And so you might sound smart, but if you can't communicate, it doesn't matter. So I hate saying this because it's so cliched, but like, if you say what your company does to your parents, to your friends not in tech, and they don't understand, you need to change how you talk about your company. Literally, one of the most important things is understanding the difference between talking about your company to a customer who will understand that jargon and will appreciate it, and talking to your company to an investor or an employee or an advisor who might not understand that jargon. And if you can't separate those 2 pitches out, you're gonna have a problem communicating. So I always say in YC, there's a customer pitch, there's an investor pitch, they're different. Don't use the same words. So clear communications thing, so excited to see. The second thing that we're excited to see is a really interesting perspective that the industry that you're attacking doesn't believe. Oftentimes, what enables founders to win is that they believe something or they know something about their industry that's controversial. That if we were to ask the incumbents, they would say, That's bullshit, I don't believe it. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. We can't grade that. But it's just great to see someone having a viewpoint and being able to attack a market from perspective that they're going to be counted out. And we think that's one of the qualities that a lot of good startups have. And then I see we're at 10 minutes, so get your questions ready. The last one I would say is a good understanding of competition. Once again, we don't want you to be doing tons of research. We don't want you to be doing 6 months of research. But a lot of ideas have been done before and are being done currently. We want to see that you looked at the marketplace and that you figured out what everyone else is doing and why it's not working, or why it could be working better. Usually that just takes an afternoon. But we shouldn't be able to stump you on one of the competitors in your space. That's extremely important. So, with that being said, I'd love to switch to questions. I don't know if there are mics somewhere. You got the mics? Beautiful. And feel free to ask me whatever you like. I'm an open book.
What do you think about solo founders? I know that usually Y Combinator likes there to be multiple co-founders, but I know Dropbox I think came in as a solo founder.
So what I'll say about every single quote-unquote rule and about YC is that it's breakable. I would say that every batch we probably fund a couple solo founders. What I will say though is that I have a pretty strong opinion that it's a lot harder to be successful in a startup as a solo founder. It's just a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of kind of emotional strain, and not having anyone to share it with is pretty tricky, especially over a 10-year period of time. So as a result, when we're reading an application and when we're in an interview and we're looking at a solo founder, the bar is higher, much higher. And so yeah, that's kind of how we look at it. Is it impossible to get into YC as a solo founder there? Nope, we do it all the time. Next question.
Hi. So how do you face applications with one founder versus multiple founders?
He just asked that, right?
No, he said solar, right?
Solo.
Solo, okay. Because it's hard to find motivated people, even though you think you have something interesting. Okay, let me rephrase it.
Okay.
Where would I look for a decent co-founder?
That's a great question. Where do you find a co-founder? I get this question all the time. There are really two plays here. The first thing is that you need to look at all of the people that you know personally and professionally. You need to approach this with a blank mind. You need to write a list of the people who you would love to work with a completely blank mind. Do not think about whether or not they want to work with you, whether or not they have family, whether or not they have responsibilities, another job, another startup. Doesn't matter. I always tell founders, make that list of 5 to 10 people and make those people say no. So often, you do not know what's going on in the lives of the people that you might want to start a company with. And you might think you do, but you don't. And I was on the receiving end of this. I didn't think I was going to start a startup. And my best friend said, Michael, do you want to join our startup? And it changed my entire life. But if he had waited for me to ask him, it wouldn't have worked. So the number one thing you have to do is you need to ask the people you want to work with and be prepared for the no. The second thing is if there are not people in your network, I strongly consider working at a startup first. I think it's extremely important to have a group of people who are interested in startups that you can basically be friends with. And sometimes if you don't come from a background that allows for that, it's better to spend a year or two at a startup and building those relationships and friends. This doesn't mean networking. This actually means friends. It's helpful to have friends who do startups when you're doing a startup. So those are usually the two typical paths. You make everyone say no, and one of the people who you know already says yes, and bam, you have a founder, a co-founder. Or you go work at a startup and you find friends who are interested in startups, and then you ask them. It's extremely hard, but I would argue that like being a good CEO, the first responsibility is recruiting your team. That's the first bar. And everyone who's successful has to hit that bar. All right, next question. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
What percentage of equity do you take once an applicant get accepted to YC?
The YC deal, which you can find on our website, it's actually right up front, is 7% for a $120,000 investment. Next question.
Hey, thank you, Michael.
Yep.
For this encouraging speech. Just wanted to ask you, so if founders are, like in different cities or in different countries, at least temporary, how it affects, the application?
I think it's tricky when founders are working in different places. It's by no means something that disqualifies you from getting into YC, but I think that the real question is, how productive are you being? So can you show that your company is still hitting its milestones, it's still getting users, it's still interacting with the customers, so on and so forth. We see some folks who are able to do that when they're in other cities. We see other folks who basically don't, who the team is split up and they've been working for a while and they're not making progress. I would argue that like if you're working for a while and you're not making progress, you need to change things. And so if that's what's happening in terms of being in different cities, then like you gotta change things. The one thing that I think people don't say enough, when I came to the Valley, people lied to me, and it was kind of sad. They lied to me because they wanted to be nice. And by being nice, they didn't give me the advice that I needed because they didn't want to hurt my feelings, because they didn't want me to go around saying that they were mean. Well, that's not really how anyone learns anything. Imagine if you did your math test and you got all the wrong answers and your teacher gave you an A and said, great job. You wouldn't learn anything. And so one of the things that took me a while to really internalize is that hey, let's talk later, that non-specific, non-encouraging, but a kind of encouraging maybe, was really a no, and there was a reason behind it. So one of the things I like to do is I like to be like crazy honest. And so what that results in is that like if a startup isn't moving forward, you need to change something. And the reality is that startups are like the NBA. For every Kobe Bryant, there are hundreds of thousands of people who wanted to be Kobe and didn't make it. People don't talk about that. It's not like going to university with a 95% graduation rate. And so like, if you are not fighting tooth and nail, and if you are not progressing, you need to change something immediately. Because literally, most people fail in this game, and if you're not striving as hard as possible, you're gonna end up in that bucket. So once again, it's another thing that makes it a little bit harder to strive, not having your team together. All right, next question.
Do you guys prefer seeded or non-seeded companies, or do you just not care?
I didn't hear that. Say that
Do you
again?
guys prefer seeded or non-seeded companies?
We don't care. So we've taken companies that literally haven't incorporated yet. We've taken companies with $40 million revenue run rates. And taken everything in between. I should have said that earlier. One of the common misconceptions is I'm too early or I'm too late for YC. I literally have not seen that be the case. YC Demo Day brings together the best early stage investors and the best Series A and B investors. They're all there. And the YC alumni community has billion-dollar companies, and it has companies that are just starting. So there's always going to be people who can give you advice. There's always going to be ways you can be motivated, and there's always going to be value. There really isn't a company that's too early or too late for YC. Okay.
Hey, my name is George, and I have a question. So I made a long way to the United States. I've been living in Europe, so I've been in design for 10 years. So I built a company in the United States, a design company, so it became an agency. But my final goal is to do my own projects, and that's why I'm here initially. So the question is maybe really simple for somebody, but I have no idea. I have no answer to this question. What is a good time to apply to Accelerator? Or I mean, like, at which stage you would like to see the companies like applying?
I think that at any point when you're actively working on your startup full-time is a point where you should consider applying. It's really simple. Like, this is not, you do not have to time YC perfectly. You don't have to time accelerators perfectly. You can apply multiple times. It's not one shot and go. So like, don't be too, that shouldn't be the thing that's like worrying you. The thing that should be worrying you is, are you working on your startup yet? If not, why not? That's it. All right, next question. Just keep talking.
Okay. I've applied for YC twice and we got rejected. And most of the points that you raised today, I believe we have been able to follow all of those and we have showed a lot of progress. So what is preventing you from giving like a 1 or 2 line feedback? It doesn't take a lot of time. It would greatly help us, improve our application the next time.
So that's a really great question. We only give feedback, personalized feedback formally to companies who complete interviews. So out of the 7,000 applications, we have about 500 companies we interview, and those are the ones that we give kind of formal feedback to. What I will say is this, is that if you email politely a YC partner, oftentimes they will actually give you informally some feedback on your application, so I would try doing that. I would also say that like sometimes there isn't a good reason, which sucks. Sometimes there isn't a good reason. Like sometimes there's, for whatever reason, the people reading the applications just thought that this other application was a little bit better. So like one of the things that we try not to do is say like, hey, your startup is bad for X, Y, and Z reason, because we're not geniuses, like we don't know. We're just taking our best read as we go through. So my time is up. What I will tell you is this. My email address is michael@ycombinator.com. I answer my emails. So if you guys have questions about YC or about your startups, you can actually reach out. Sometimes I'm really fast and like I'll surprise you and answer in 30 seconds. Sometimes it'll take me 2 weeks. But I do answer every single email. And that's kind of one of the ways that I think investors should act. So that's how I act. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.